True as gold, a comma green, we steady on the rise. Digging truth from ancient scenes, we open blinded eyes. Rhyme sharp like pirates' lines, we break the bondage tight. Kanji speaking revolution, keep the fire burning. Chimpy drums guide our stride, we march with purpose proud. No more silence, we collide, our voices thunder loud. Politics and history, we stitch them in every verse. From Pharaoh's throne to Yaoundé streets, we claim the kanji verse.
This was a collection of tweets, that I wanted to respond to. And I just wanted to describe how the wholesale borrowing of a lot of these Western concepts, from religion to economics to government and politics to, even some of the more benign academic fields, science, engineering, mathematics, linguistics, these linguistic categories, archaeology, history, they can really confound, the perspective that we have with respect to, African culture and African history. So this starts from a tweet from an individual that, to me is a grifter, but is putting some interesting content out before. He goes by the name of Isaac Samuel. And I've criticized him, in the past on one of my lives for writing what I described as one of the worst articles on Cheikh Anta Diop and the African-centered scholarship movement that I've ever seen in my life. It was really bad, from citing the likes of Clarence Walker and Stephen Howe and just these bad actors who we know have bias and are against Black scholars, so I've went after him in the past, for some of the mistakes that he made. But he posted this, and this is a Kikuyu man with long braided hair, right? And as a quote, you see Great House Mark basically saying, I find it interesting how the Kikuyu wholesale adopted Nilotic culture. Usually it's autochthonous people adopting Bantu culture. So there are numerous issues that I find with this tweet here, right? First of all, the term Nilotic, like if Nilotic is referring geographically to the Nile Basin, that river basin, the largest river in the world, there are a lot of different diversities of people and, populations, cultures from the basin, the beginning of the basin around the Rwenzori Mountains, where the Necher Hapi dwells, according to classical African text, all the way up to the Delta. Now, if specifically you're referring to Greenberg's waste bucket, what many Africanists today call Nilo-Saharan, then that's also hypothetical at best, because that's not a category that's been confirmed. Within the realm of African linguistics, specifically Africanist linguistics, which is a completely different field than historical linguistics or diachronic linguistics, also sometimes added on as historical comparative linguistics. But the Africanist field, they don't use the same methodology. They don't have the morphological analysis of Cheikh Anta Diop when he compares forms in Wolof to Metrem and Khmer, the Pharaonic language. They don't have the morphological regularity of Théophile Obenga when he compares Dagara and Burkina Faso to the Pharaonic language. They're not following the Indo-European rigorous standard, which is what Théophile Obenga stated that African historical linguistics should be based on. Malay, Benveniste, Saussure, some of the classical giants with respect to historical comparative linguistics. The Africanists don't follow this. So right off the bat, you have the adoption, as Mark put it, the wholesale adoption of Eurocentric categories, especially when it comes to defining African populations. And in most cases, these are not living categories. And when I use living, I'm using living linguistically. They are not categories that deal with living languages and living realities. They are imports, scholastic and academic imports from the West. Now, many of you are fully aware of the idea that Hamitic scholars, Hamiticists, were the primary ones behind the development of most of the Africanist language categories, from Hamito-Semitic, which became Afro-Asiatic, Nigritic, which was later combined with Capharitic or Capharian to become Negro Congo or Niger Congo. It was originally called Western Sudanic and Eastern Sudanic. Eastern Sudanic became so-called Nilo-Saharan. You have the Khoisan languages, which are now considered defunct and debunked. And all of these different categories originated from Africanist, from Hamiticist, right? And Greenberg tried to clean it up with his lumping, excessive lumping, and his creation of these categories. But none of these categories have been proven. Even the strongest phyla in the Africanist toolset is Afro-Asiatic, and it doesn't even come close to meeting the standard of Indo-European. Time depth, notwithstanding, there is not a universally agreed upon set of protoforms within Afro-Asiatic. They just say that most likely the languages are related, in the same way that some of the long rangers state, like Russell Shue among them, Bender among them, they postulate that Niger Congo and Nilo-Saharan and Afro-Asiatic are related under a family called supraequatorial. So the Africanists always operate on the standard of it might be related sometime in the past, but they don't deal with the rigorous analysis of historical comparative linguistics. But again, beyond that, it's just difficult to correlate something like braided hair to a Nilotic culture, when this is a hairstyle that you can see throughout the African continent, from the west to the east. Now, what Mark is pointing at when he points to the autochthonous people adopting so-called Bantu culture is the Bantu model as postulated by scholars such as Christopher Ehret, who passed, earlier this year, and Malcolm Guthrie, where they have different models of the Bantu migration from the Nigero-Cameroonian border into Central and Southern Africa and even East Africa. And Christopher Ehret's Bantu model involves Cushitic people being replaced by Western Bantu speakers, and the hybrid of Cushitic people and Western Bantu people being Eastern Bantus, like the people are among the Swahili coast. And many scholars, such as Felix Chami, have had a problem with this, not only because of the lack of archaeological and linguistic evidence, but it speaks to a type of Hamiticist colonialism where Eastern Bantu people are unable to be the authors of their own destiny, right? And it just speaks to a lack of analysis, a lack of rigor with respect to the analysis. Most conventional Africana scholars, from Lunyigo to Mubabingi Bilolo to Digi, they actually postulate a multi-regional, multi-generational model that produced the people who are now classified as Bantu, right? So the idea that, these cultures are usually adopted by Bantu speakers speaks to an analysis that's rooted in the Western Greenbergian Africanist model, that Bantu migration model. And again, this model was created by these Africanists, by these Eurocentric scholars, to give them a pretext of invading South Africa, the Boers, stealing land from the indigenous African people, and claiming that, they did it to this hypothetical group called Khoisan that is now considered debunked, right? So because of that, because of these so-called, hypothetical Proto-Bantu speakers came into South Africa, and took over the land, that gives the Boers the right to take over the land. And we know that this is foolishness. There's obviously intermingling between these populations, from lactose intolerance genetics to even some of the light skin genetics that, descended into some of the Coena people, as well as a lot of the EM2 and EM35 subclades, EM293, EL516, et cetera, that many modern Bantu populations have, right? So that is completely inaccurate, right? So braided hair, again, is seen across the continent, and scholars have made the mistake, which is one of the cardinal mistakes in historical linguistics, of linking cultural and linguistic phenomenon. Hair, calorites, even iron are not signs of, genealogical or linguistic identity. In many cases, a lot of the pottery and ironworking, if the Bantu category is legitimate, could have been spread into that population by so-called non-Bantus, right? So there's also the assumption that there can't be any independent innovation. Hair can obviously arise independently as opposed to being borrowed, right? And cultural contact isn't one way, it's oftentimes reciprocal, right? So a lot of times a mass comparison, trying to create these rigid, plantation dividing lines between African populations, it forces single direction diffusion narratives. When again, according to the analysis of Mubabingi Bilolo, Umdigi, Fukiao, Lunyigo, and many of the scholars who worked on the AU fact book, the relationship between the Bantu speakers, so-called Bantus, was a multi-regional, multi-directional development. There's no unified protoform that can be traced back to a Nigero-Cameroonian border Urhamat or homeland. Bantu is definitely not reconstructed to the level of Indo-European. And in most cases, people like Dixon in his rule of punctuated equilibrium say that it's impossible for it to be reconstructed. You see, there's a lack of systematic correspondences, but you do have these correspondences when you compare many of these Southern and Central African languages to the Pharaonic language using the Obenga-Diopian model, much to the disdain of many of these Africanist promoters who are really slow and don't really read much, don't understand the data itself, and they don't understand why these categories are flawed, right? So again, it's a false binary between these different populations, and it gets back to why we need to use African languages, like Nana Obadele Kambon has always articulated, and many of the scholars that we have articulated, because these are artifacts of linguistic hypotheses. There is no Proto-Afro-Asiadoid or Congoid. In many cases, African people have genealogical terms used to describe past populations, which is why historical linguists have used and developed these different models, right? And there's something to be said about Jean-Claude Mboli and Nassar Imhotep, who have claimed to be able to reconstruct, the so-called Bantu languages with this Chiena-Ntu that the Nassar Imhotep made, following after the Chaluba, conventions of Mubabingi Bilolo. But that's not necessarily, even though some of the things that they say may have merit, that model is not necessarily the truth. The stronger, more rigorous Indo-European based model, IPA based model, phonological and morphological reconstruction of the ancient Pharaonic language prior to comparison with modern African languages model, the Obenga-Diopian Ngom model, where you have legitimate evidence of a genealogical relationship between the Sawa or the Douala language in Cameroon and the ancient Pharaonic language. That's the model that we need to be following. That's the model that we need to be using. It's more rigorous, and it just avoids just the petty mistakes, the overgeneralizations, the confounding culture and language and genetics, the ignorance of independent innovation, the assumptions of one-way borrowing. It just collapses when you apply rigor to this conversation. So, I think, shout out to these brothers here. I think some of them are a little bit more learned than others, but overall, they're completely divorced from the accurate, rigorous scholarship on the continent and in the Afrospora and the diaspora that's happening. 10 years, 20 years from now, it'll be embarrassing that so many people, so many Negroes were stepping fetch it for these Africanists. It'll be an embarrassing thing. But again, now there's only a radical vanguard minority of people sounding the alarm, trying to wake everybody up. And we're eventually going to be victorious once people actually look at the data and stop, get their head from out of their ass and actually look at the data itself. It's pretty simple and straightforward to come to the right conclusion. So that's all I got for y'all on this one. I hope to catch you on the next one. Peace.
True as gold, a comma green, we steady on the rise. Digging truth from ancient scenes, we open blinded eyes. Rhyme sharp like pirates' lines, we break the bondage tight. Kanji speaking revolution, keep the fire burning. Shimpe drums guide our stride, we march with purpose proud. No more silence, we collide, our voices thunder loud. Politics and history, we stitch them in every verse. From Pharaoh's throne to Yaoundé streets, we claim the Kanji verse.